Welcome to the Weekly Canadian Culture Wars Report. My name is Shannon Boucher. This is part of a special series that I have called the Genius Model of Social Contagion. And it's not because I'm a genius. I'm talking about something that was referred to in Roman times as a genius, a personal spirit, a guardian spirit, or a guiding spirit. Before that, the Greeks called it a daimon, but it's been represented in cultures around the world. And if you are interested in learning more about what the genius is and some of the psychological and scientific underpinnings that we understand today about how this works, you can check out my last video. Today, I want to talk about the structure of neuroticism. It's kind of weird. Now, weird isn't a deviation from the usual theme of this series of videos. Maybe I'm going to start with, before I get to the structure of neuroticism, and will open up a pathway to a much greater implication, more profound model of the world that's integrating kind of classical Hellenistic philosophy and even pre-Hellenistic. So we're talking about, 300, 400, 500 BC in the Western tradition. It's going to integrate some practice from that period of time. But before we do that, I want to read you and share with you a language construction that comes. This is a book called The Gnostic Gospels by Elaine Pagels. This is actually a trilogy all in one, so it looks a bit like a doorstop. But I was fascinated by this language construction when I was reading this recently. Now, we're talking about 1st and 2nd and 3rd century Christianity, where Christianity is aiming to get a foothold in society. They are standing even unto martyrdom in the belief in Christ and refusing to renounce Christ to embrace Caesar. Now, Pagels says, charged with the unpleasant duty of ordering executions for non-compliance, Roman officials often tried to persuade the accused to save their own lives. According to contemporary accounts, after the aged and reverend Bishop Polycarp of Smyrna in Asia Minor was arrested by the police, here's the quote, and this is a translation from an earlier text. The governor tried to persuade him to recant, saying, have respect for your age, and other similar things that they usually say. Swear by the genius of the emperor. Recant, say, away with these atheists. Polycarp, with a sober expression, looked at all the mob of lawless pagans who were in the stadium and said, away with the atheists? The governor persisted and said, swear and I will let you go. Curse Christ. But Polycarp answered, for 86 years I've been his servant, and he's done me no wrong. If you decide yourself into thinking that I will swear by the emperor's genius, as you say, if you pretend not to know who I am, listen, and I will tell you plainly that I am a Christian. Dancing around 1st and 2nd and 3rd century pagan texts is a tricky business. And talking about a genius and religion is also a sticky subject. And I hope that people can suspend their judgment and criticism long enough to kind of chew on the ideas that I'm sharing with you about the nature of the genius. As I said in my last video, I point to the individual genius as a function of the reticular formation system. That is the unconscious part of ourselves that filters the vast amounts of data and sensory inputs that barrage our systems every second. And that part of us filters, deletes, distorts, generalizes until it forms a coherent map or model of the world, which is really about where our attention goes at any given moment. Thank you for paying attention to this video, by the way. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel and like. We're going to come back in a couple of weeks with more about current politics after I've kind of framed out this idea of the genius model. And I'm going to talk today about the structure of neuroticism, and that's an individual relationship with the individual genius. And then I want to talk about disintegration at a macro social level. I don't know if I'm going to get to that second piece in this episode today, but I'm going to end up tying what I'm talking about to the Big Five personality type model, which is a standard psychological model for understanding personality today. And I think that there's a misapprehension of the notion of what neuroticism is within the Big Five spectrum. Neuroticism is an incapacity to effectively manage our attention. We are the victims of the environment that we're in, external and internal, and we're unable to effectively manage the attentional switching within our system. That we've got a mad genius, let's call it, that is constantly trying to get our attention with things that are either irrelevant or it's looping us into ruminations and obsessive thoughts and cycles of of analysis, circular reasoning going round and round again. I don't know if you've ever had internal dialogue keeping you up at night, but in the cases of extreme neuroticism, people are overwhelmed by the internal impulses that dominate the tableau of their attention and their consciousness. So let's start with what the internal landscape, what our internal landscape looks like. And as you know by now, I'm not afraid to use some weird language. So, I'm going to talk about these things in psychological terms, but I'm also going to make reference to the language that we used to describe these phenomena before we used scientism and the great rationalization and to kind of flatten our psychic landscape. And what I mean by flatten is this. Many of the people watching this video will know who Jonathan Haidt is, a professor of psychology at New York University. He's written a bunch of stuff. The Happiness Hypothesis is one of the early works that I read of Jonathan Haidt, but talks about the rider and the elephant. And his model, the rider is the conscious mind. That's what I call the eye behind the eyes. And the elephant is the large and unmanageable, incredibly strong forces, aggregate forces of the unconscious mind. But Haidt doesn't make any distinction, about the different internal forces that he categorizes as this elephant. So let's start with this. Family systems theory. If you've ever had any exposure to addiction dynamics, whether it's drug addiction or alcohol or abusive systems, and you've gone through a process, or people who have of recovery or Al-Anon or Narcanon, support for family of people who have serious addiction problems or authoritarian problems. The family systems model says that in a dysfunctional family system, everybody plays a role. Setting aside for a moment that in a functional system, in a family, everybody plays a role. But it's easier to understand in the caricaturized extremes of an abusive family dynamic how some of these different roles work. And in the abusive dynamic, people are wearing masks or they're getting false projections put onto them. So roles are imposed on them in an abusive or dysfunctional family dynamic, imposed externally, often by the abuser. Whereas in a functional family system, the individuals are allowed and encouraged to grow up and flourish closer to who they are as people. So there's less hiding and there's less lying and denial in a functional system, obviously, than in dysfunctional. So what are the roles? And you may already know some of these. There's, of course, the abuser or the addict. Then there's an enabler. Often that's the other parent or the other parental figure. If you've got a large enough family system, you've got a golden child who can do no wrong. You've got a child who is a lost child or a problem child that is acting out some of the dysfunction of the system. And then there is a scapegoat or a whistleblower. And these small family system dynamics scale. So you can actually see them at play in dysfunctional workplace systems or in dysfunctional political systems. So there's an old expression going back to that 1st and 2nd century period, as above and so below. It talks about the parallel structures between the microcosmic and the macrocosmic, meaning the level of scale at which these things apply. Now, at an individual level, we internalize the external world. We build an internal map of reality. And it's kind of weird to say, but we don't actually ever experience reality out there as it is. We experience a set of filters, as I've talked about with the genius, that filters out until we have a representation of the external reality, which may or may not reflect reality itself. Kind of like in the functional family system, we have a better apprehension of who we are and our individual natures and personalities, and let's call them spirits. And in a dysfunctional system, we have a less coherent, less accurate model of the self. So everybody builds an internal representation of the external world. That's how we navigate the reality, the universe that we're in. And family systems theory was a therapeutic model, a group dynamics model that treated the family system of dysfunction. And then along came internal family systems with the idea that sometimes people in the dysfunctional family system aren't available. The addict or the problem child or the abuser may not be in the life of the person seeking therapy. So the therapists went to what they call the internal family systems model, which is working with the internal representations of those other people in our lives. So I grew up in a dysfunctional family. I was one of 3 kids. I used to say, my brother causes shit, I got the shit, my sister's shit didn't stink. It was a pretty clear model of I was the scapegoat and whistleblower in the family. My brother was the problem child, got into all kinds of trouble. And then my sister was the golden child. And none of those really mapped onto who we really were, as far as I can tell. But the system produced what the system produced. Now, I have an internal representation in me of my mother unit and of my father unit and of my sibling units. And there's something in cognitive science that we call a theory of mind. So human beings have this unique capacity, as far as we know. And it may be arguable that some animals have this as well. A theory of mind is an internal representation of what another person is thinking and feeling. So we create an internal image, an internal representation of that other person in our own psyche, within that domain of our awareness, even unconscious awareness, where we have a relationship with the image of the person in our mind. And that may or may not reflect accurately the relationship with the external person. And you have experienced theory of mind. We've definitely seen it in film and television, even in books, where we see people rehearsing a wedding proposal or rehearsing an argument with the boss or that sort of thing, looking in a mirror. And you're familiar with what I'm saying, I'm sure. So internal family systems built up this model where we can work with internal parts, psychic parts that we have, of the different people and influences in our lives. And that's one level of our internal psychic landscape is relationships. There are some cultures, by the way, one stands out in particular, which is the Hawaiian Huna tradition. They believe that at a metaphysical level, I'm going to call it the Platonic level, so a non-material level, we have an internal relationship connected by a thread to everyone that we've ever come in contact with in our lives, especially people who we've touched, like a handshake or made eye contact with or had conversations with. And the deeper our relationship and our connection with that person, the stronger the thread is that connects us, and the more alive the internal and influential the internal representation of that relationship is to the individual. So internal family systems has a set of modalities and processes for integrating conflicts and evolving relationships internally in ourselves with our theories of mind, or sometimes we call these cognitive agents, with our internal cognitive agent, our representation of key other people in our environment. This is modern psychology. Parts integration is NLP. There are various other modalities that integrate internal conflicts. Internal family systems is one of them, but there are others. So this is pretty mainstream psychology at this point and well understood. So here's where I put forward the structure of neuroticism. Do we need to go deeper? We need to go deeper on another level of these structures. Okay, so let's go just a little deeper on. So at one layer, we've got our family, our representations of family relationships and extended relationships with other people and events in our lives that we construct models of in our mind. And at a deeper unconscious level, we have a number of different structures that I've talked about before. In one video, I referred to Prometheus as a anthropomorphization or a personification of a brain function. His name is forethought, and his brother's name, Epimetheus, is hindsight, and Mnemosyne is memory, the goddess of memory, and her daughters are the 9 muses, the creative sort of capacities that we human beings have access to. And in some models of the world, a relationship with these figures, these archetypal figures, is well understood. But in the West, we flattened this out. So we've got the rider, we've got the elephant, and that's all we get into in terms of the structure of our internal mind. So here's the structure of neuroticism. We have this reticular activating system, this spirit guide or this genius that is in charge of helping us navigate sensory information in the world out there, but also to manage the structure of the internal archetypes and relationships that we have in our own minds. I've read that this figure is a conduit to dreams, for example. And what we're really dealing with is an internal connector that we've personified as a spirit guide or a genius or a daimon that plugs us into various impulses and psychic structures within our own unconscious. So a person who's struggling with neurotic tendencies has a switching problem. So if we think of the genius as a switching mechanism, an attentional switch, it's like short-circuiting and plugging into intense emotions that are creating a dysfunction for the individual in their navigation of life. There's obsessions and ruminations and circular talk and catastrophization, and we could categorize things in this language. For me, we could categorize things to include ADD and PTSD. This is where we don't have full control of our internal emotional landscape, and it's cracking through into our day-to-day lives, or dominating our psychic experience. This structure of neuroticism related to this psychic figure, this genius or this messenger spirit, is what we have understood in other cultures and other times as neuroticism. I talked about the big five earlier in this video, and neuroticism is one I usually leave until last in terms of descriptors here, but I'm going to attempt to, in a very short period of time that we have left, to talk about the big five personality type inventory and the Hellenistic archetypes of the gods of Olympus. And it's more like the gods of the heavens, being the stars. So, wasn't that long ago we didn't have TV, we didn't have radio, we didn't have any kind of recording, vinyl imprinting. Our attention wasn't sucked up by rich and demanding media that we have today. And I don't mean spiritually rich, I just mean overwhelming to the senses rich. And so human beings spent thousands of years around the campfire, observing the night sky without modern light pollution. And the heavens were a fundamental part of our ontological framework, our relationship with the cosmos. So if you're unfamiliar, we of course have 12 major constellations, and they're roughly 1 month of the year. And those constellations form a band. They're fixed in our sky in terms of their position, and the Earth revolves on its axis. What that means is that every 2 hours, if we're looking to the east, every 2 hours, a new constellation is coming over the horizon. And this was important because it was calendrical for agricultural human beings and for nomadic and shepherding human beings. It allowed people, it was a psychotechnology, it allowed people to orient themselves within a field of time, especially the seasons. And the sun and the moon and these constellations were extremely important. The constellations became pegs or mnemonic hooks, okay? So there's a relationship between memory and the constellations of the sky, and storytelling and the genius. And each of the constellations had a story that related to particular events happening on Earth. Now that sounds weird, but and it risks going into the territory of taboo astrology, where there's a switch that people flip and say, well, that's just astrology, we're going to throw that out, it's bunk. And I'm very fortunate to have a friend who is a traditional Nizhga storyteller from northwestern British Columbia. He received the birthright gift of memory skills and is a storyteller and keeper of the knowledge. And he explained to me when I visited him in the Nass Valley back in 2022 that there are two immortal Nizhga spirits or gods that live on the top of the tallest mountain that observe the sky. They are the messengers, essentially, of the stories of the heavens. And each of the constellations, as they're marked by month or by day, have a story associated with them. So some of those stories are, when are the salmon running and when are the ulakan running, and those are related to cycles of the moon. And if you've ever heard of the Farmer's Almanac, the Farmer's Almanac is a calendrical map of moon cycles. Moon cycles and seasonal cycles relate to when plants, start growing and stop growing, and when they shift from spring to summer, sort of physiology. So there are 7 movable planets or heavenly bodies. The first 2 I've already talked about, the sun and the moon. Well, I've actually already talked about 3 of them. Neuroticism, Mercury. So Mercury is a trickster figure. It's a messenger of the gods. It's the fast-moving planet that runs and is constantly moving between around the constellations, close to the sun. It frequently has conjunctions or relationships in the heavens with the other planets, Mars, Venus, Saturn, and Jupiter. Those archetypes, Mars, Aries, the god Mars, Aries, Venus, Aphrodite, we have Zeus or Jupiter, and then we've got Saturn, Kronos, as the 4 slower moving planets. And Mercury is understood in story, reflected in the heavens as going between these different other patterns. Now I guess I have to outline where the big 5 personality type inventory came from, because that's going to illuminate for you why this makes sense. So the big 5 personality inventory is the most well-documented, well-replicated personality inventory model that we have. It has been found valid, statistically valid it's more than 30 languages, more than 150 replication studies. It was kind of recalled or remembered in the early 1980s when personality science came back into vogue. And it had an original flourishing in the 1920s. I think it was 1921, Jung published Personality Types. But some years later, in the early 30s, it became of real interest. There was a guy named Marston at Harvard, and he came up with the foundations of what we call the DISC profile, which stands for driver, influence, supportive, and maybe it's conscientious. So it's a 4-quadrant model of personality type and inventory. And then there was a number of others that kind of came up around that, a lot to do with the 4 quadrants. So Jung's work ended up becoming the Myers Briggs personality inventory. The DISC profile, the 4-quadrant model, ended up, it's based on much older models. So sanguine, choleric, phlegmatic, and melancholic is a 4-quadrant kind of middle-age model of the human constitution. Earth, water, fire, and air is another one. The indigenous 4-quadrant medicine wheel, east, south, west, and north, and the 4 colors of black, red, white, and yellow are maps of the human psyche or the human constitution. So the Hellenistic ancients, the pre-classical Levantine, the Middle Eastern, Mediterranean people kept stories of these figures in the sky. And so Mars or Aries ended up hooked with the masculine aggressive traits, and Venus, Aphrodite, ended up kind of hooked with the stories of feminine, call them agreeableness traits, or the archetypes of feminine and fertility. And we can think of those in terms of yin and yang. So yin being feminine energy, yang being masculine energy. Masculine energy is outside the village, it's exploratory, it has aggressive or externality, or it's called in the Big Five extroversion. And Venus has all the feminine traits, the typical trait type of females. In the modern Big Five, it's called agreeableness. Now, these are registered as a spectrum. So we've got high extroversion, low extroversion. We've got high agreeableness, low agreeableness, or disagreeableness. Then with Jupiter, which relates to Zeus or the god Jupiter, is a growth and expansion. It's openness. And Saturn, or Chronos, which is time. And all these have much deeper archetypal structures to them if, given enough contemplation. But Saturn is structure, it's order, it's matrix of let me go to some Confucian expression, ruler, minister, father, son. It's about the propriety of relationships and the rightness of relationships. So conscientiousness is rooted in the archetype of Saturn. So in the 1930s, and by the way, modern psychologists they either haven't said it out loud or they haven't made the connection yet. But the Big Five personality type is actually classical astrological symbolism. Jung would have seen this easily. In the 1930s, researchers in trying to map personality types took the Oxford English Dictionary. They extracted all the adjectives, which is a big job because the OED is not a small dictionary. And as they extracted all the adjectives, it seemed that these adjectives fell into kind of 5 piles of behavior types and categories. And so that received some attention in the 1930s, and it wasn't until the 1980s when it got picked up again. The researchers, these different times, because people have arrived at this conclusion that there are broadly 5 categories, or this Big Five, the acronym is CANOE or ocean. So CANOE is conscientiousness, agreeableness, and neuroticism, extroversion, and openness and extroversion, CANOE. That's the acronym. In the 1980s, these adjectives and this language, these categories were extracted through conversational or question and answer kind of exercises. And it seems, again, that people's behavior falls neatly into these 5 personality types. And we have dominant expression of certain personality, certain aspects of these personality types individual. So I am in the Big Five, I'm a high openness, low neuroticism. I'm a little bit above the midline in conscientiousness, depending on the day. And the older I get, the less agreeable I am. But the way that this model of neuroticism, I think, works is that we're actually talking about a 4-quadrant model plus Mercury or plus the genius or plus the daimon, which is the messenger. That's the internal, that function within us that highlights things that are salient and deletes and distorts and ignores things that aren't. It can be a high functioning genius or high functioning daimon. is an even temperament, not easily swayed by distraction or rumination or obsession that happens in the case of someone who is high in neuroticism. That's the fifth category. And I believe that it has to do with internal switching and our a bit like a muscle that we might develop. There are ways to go from a highly neurotic individual through to, a managed relationship with the daimon so that we're not flotsam and jetsam in the field of sensory data input and perception. So I think that brings me to the end of the structure of neuroticism and the nature of the genius. And I want to go back to, because now we've talked about the internal landscape and how dysfunctional internal psychological relationships mediated by, an underdeveloped attentional switching mechanism or reticular formation system just can flood our conscious mind with, objects and fears and paranoias and even to the certain extent that, it's fairly well understood. If you approach any kind of practice of meditation, the purpose of meditation is to settle these internal objects or these theories of minds or these internal cognitive agents, as they're sometimes called. And that in settling those, what happens is it opens up a bandwidth of attention and opens up the capacity for internal and external relationships that are pure and clean so that we can get more accurate sense of who we are in the world. That might be it for today, the genius model of social contagion. It seems to me that this leads to another video where I'm going to be talking about our relationships. So we've talked about internal and the structure of neuroticism, and now we're going to talk about external, as how the genius filters the external world in terms of relationships, particularly with groups. And I'm going to build a bit more on that passage that I read to you from Elaine Pagels about the early Christians who were encouraged to renounce Christ and to turn their relationships and to profess fealty to the genius of Caesar. Shannon Boucher, this is the Weekly Canadian Culture Wars Report, special edition in a series on the genius model of social contagion. Check out my other videos that have led up to this. If you've watched this video and you haven't seen any of the others, start with video number 2 because you can skip the introduction, where I talk about the nature of group coherence and that as default for human relationships versus individualism. So once again, like and subscribe. Tune in next Sunday. I aim to publish these early in the afternoon on Sundays Eastern Time. Set the notification bell and give me your feedback. Ask questions, make some comments. Am I way off the mark here? Because I'm really producing and sharing this as a result or a product of a long internal dialogos and contemplation with that part of me that I now understand as a personal genius, my own daimon and guide in many aspects of my life.